Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jennifer Lackey. She is Wayne and Elizabeth Jones Professor of Philosophy at Northwestern University in the US. She specializes in epistemology with a particular emphasis on a broad range of issues in social epistemology. And today we're going to talk about her book, The Epistemology of Groups. So Dr. Lackey, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So tell us first, what is the epistemology of groups? I mean, what is the sort of subfield of epistemology, right? And what kinds of questions does it deal with?
So there are quite a number of questions that one can take up when looking at, broadly speaking, the epistemology of groups. I mean, what motivated me with this project ultimately is wanting to be able to hold groups such as a corporation, for instance, or a university or an institution, even like the criminal legal system, responsible for their actions. When we think about some of the actions that groups take, I mean, let's just think about the COVID-19 vaccine, right? I mean, we really depend on Pfizer or Moderna or Johnson & Johnson, or, we really depend on there being trust and there being responsible epistemic agents, so to speak. So when they tell us, when they assert something, when they take an action, those are grounded by states like beliefs and knowledge. And we expect Pfizer to know that the vaccine is safe when they tell us that the vaccine is safe. We expect Moderna to know that children 5 to 11 can have the vaccine when they tell us that is the case. And I should be clear from the example, there can be like life-altering consequences when groups speak when they don't have the proper epistemic status. That is, when they don't know, or they don't have rational beliefs or good evidence and so on. So I was really interested in exploring that space where the grounding of groups' beliefs really bear on our normative assessment of their actions.
So here you are connecting epistemology to ethics or ethical questions, correct? It's not just trying to understand how epistemology works in groups.
Well, I think that we can't really answer those questions about responsibility without having an epistemology of groups, right? Just think about, like all of the concerns, like with the Bush administration and weapons of mass destruction, right? When people were, saying that the Bush administration was responsible for the loss of all of these lives, it mattered whether the Bush administration believed or had good reason to believe, or knew or justifiably believe. Well, they clearly didn't know because it was false. But did they have good reason for thinking that there were weapons of mass destruction? And one of the reasons why the criticism was so powerful was because the public came to believe that the Bush administration did not have reason to believe or evidence for believing that there were weapons of mass destruction. And so it matters, like we can't really talk about questions of group responsibility without having some sort of epistemological framework. It matters a great deal to understanding their level of culpability or responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Do you use any specific definition of group here, or is it just a commonsensical definition like a collective of people?
Yeah. So I don't think that groups, in the sense I'm interested in, are mere collections of individuals. I mean, you might look out your window and there might be 8 people like having a conversation, outside of your window. That would just be a mere collection of individuals, perhaps. I mean, maybe they're like some club or something meeting to talk about something. But if they're just, kind of a group of people walking on the street who happen to be asking, if anyone saw a lost dog, that's just a mere collection of individuals. I think that there are different kinds of groups. A lot of different kinds of groups, and I'll just flag a few different kinds. I mean, there are what we might call deliberative groups, and those are groups that have the capacity to engage in some sort of collective deliberation. So in a paradigmatic case of a deliberative group might be like a jury, right? There's 12 of them, they're handpicked, their job is to sit and deliberate and come to a conclusion about whether or not, the defendant has been found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. A very classic case of a deliberative group. But when we're thinking about something like Pfizer, how do we even understand something like Pfizer, right? Or, an example I use in my book a lot, like Philip Morris, right? How do we understand, corporations or businesses or institutions, like very large kind of large groups where there's not 12 people sitting around engaging in collective deliberation. So I think that there are differences. I think that there are important differences between a group like a jury and a group like Philip Morris. What unites them, in my opinion, and one of the things that I focus on in my book, is groups that are subject to normative assessment. So what I'm interested in are groups that we would say they were rational or irrational, responsible, irresponsible, that was good, that was bad, from a moral point of view. And I think that we would say that both of a jury and of Pfizer, right, we would both hold them to some kind of normative assessment, whereas, less so a mere collection of individuals, right? I mean, maybe if there were there was a story recently about a train and someone was attacked on the train, and nobody helped her. And there was a real criticism of the people on that train, but it was a criticism of them as individuals and maybe to some extent as a crowd. But it's not as though we think of them as some sort of unified collective entity, like the people on the train at that time, right? And so I think that what unites the kinds of groups that I'm interested in is this being subject to normative assessment.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, from your perspective, how do you deal with the individuals that are part of a particular group? Because these might raise some methodological questions in the social sciences, particularly when trying to understand social phenomena. Many times people resort to methodological individualism and try to understand things from, how they happen in the minds of the individuals who compose that particular collective, instead of thinking or at the level of the collective, let's say.
Yeah, so I think that this is really a central question in the epistemology of groups. Right. What is the role of the individual members and the group as a whole? How do we understand this relationship? And there are, very broadly speaking, and these are really broad brushes, two very different ways of approaching this question. And on the one end of the spectrum, there are views that we might call summativist or deflationary. And those views say that really there are no interesting questions to be asked about groups. Really, all the interesting questions take place at the level of individuals, right? So groups just really are when we're asking about, questions about, group knowledge or group justified belief or group rational belief, really, we're just asking questions about the status of those individual members. And so in a sense, on this view, we don't really have to ask questions about an epistemology of groups, because what we say about individuals is really going to amount to what we say about those groups. And that's a very deflationary or summativist view. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have views that are kind of what we might call inflationary or non-summativist. And those views, you've got people who literally talk about groups having minds of their own. And on those views, and there are very different perspectives there and very different arguments that get to the same conclusion, the states of groups can really float freely of the groups of the states of individual members. So one of the theses on that side is, for instance, you can have a group that knows something or believes something, even if no individual member knows it or believes it. And so in that sense, there's no way that the group state can reduce to the states of individual members, because you can have group knowledge when no individual member knows it. So that's at the other end of the spectrum, where groups are really robust epistemological or moral agents, because their states can really float freely of the individual states. Now, There's also within the inflationary camp, there's differing degrees of inflation, so to speak. So some people would argue that there has to be something like a collective acceptance or joint acceptance of a proposition in order for there to be collective belief. But other theorists say that you don't even need anything like that. And so group states on that view would float freely, even of individual members being around to do some sort of collective activity. So there are very, very, very inflationary views on that side. But really, you see that the role of individual members can be either fairly robust on the deflationary end of the spectrum, or really not very central at all on the far end of the inflationary spectrum.
Can we talk about agency on the group level?
Yeah, so I think that one of the things that I try to really emphasize in my book is thinking about groups as agents in their own right in a robust kind of way. So I'm not an inflationary theorist that, in the sense of like being really far at this end of the spectrum. One way of thinking, although I have different things to say about things like group actions than I do to say about group beliefs and knowledge. So, I mean, let's divide those up. And on the side of the view where I'm interested in things like belief states and knowing states, I think that individual states have to play some sort of anchoring role. And what I mean by that is, I don't think that you can have a state of group knowledge where that floats entirely freely of what's going on at the individual level. But I still think that groups are epistemic agents in their own right. And what I mean by that is, when you have a group of members in a group, the relationships that obtain between the evidential frameworks that those members have interact. And in that sense, those evidential relations create evidential relations that are over and above anything you find at the individual level. And this is really obvious, right? I mean, like, I bring a certain body of evidence to my group. You might bring a different body of evidence to the group. I don't share your evidence, all of your evidence. You don't share all of my evidence. And so when we're talking about the evidence at the group level, there are evidential relations that obtain between the different members that do not obtain within any individual's framework itself. And so because of that, and because I think that we need to think about those evidential relations, I think that there is a kind of epistemic agency or group agency that emerges at that level of groups that you don't find at the individual level. And so in that sense, I mean, that's just one of the ways in which I think we should be talking about groups as being agents.
And this is your group agent account, correct?
This is one of the dimensions of my group agent account. That's correct.
And what are the other important dimensions here?
So I think that one of the things that emerges from these sorts of evidential relations is that so one of the things that I start off with in the book in the introduction is that, like, when you look, like, for instance, this is just an example, but it's a powerful example. When you look at the way that, like, the criminal legal system in the United States treats, let's say, a corporation that is like Philip Morris, you know, like when there were cases brought that they knew that cigarettes caused very serious health problems and deceived the public into believing that cigarettes were safer than they in fact are. So in a lot of, like, let's just like think about that. In cases like that, you find two different sorts of responses. There have been rulings that treat groups as like totally unique entities in their own right. And so you'll find corporations saying, we take responsibility for this horrible action, fine us, you know, slap us with some sort of, like, you know, amount of money we have to pay. but like no individual employees should get wrapped up in this. And then you see other, like Volkswagen as an example that comes to mind, where like when they're being accused of like really systemic level deception, they will say, oh, there were like just a couple of rogue engineers, really, it was just a couple of really bad apples. And if you get rid of those like rogue engineers or those like bad apples, then like Volkswagen, we have no culpability whatsoever. So you see these two different ends. I mean, again, kind of really mirroring what we were talking about earlier with deflationary and inflationary views. You see that mirrored in the way that groups and individual members are held accountable, for instance, within the criminal legal system. And so one of the things that I want to do with my framework is bring out the extent to which both of these capture something really important. And like, we shouldn't be holding groups and individuals responsible in an either or fashion, right? And so one of the things that I emphasize in my book is that there are important things that emerge only at the group level, and there are important things that happen with particular individuals. And so when we're thinking about like a case like Volkswagen, where there were engineers who were engaging in some, clear deception, but there were also very clear systemic level problems, it shouldn't be, do we either hold a couple of individual employees responsible or the group responsible, but that there might be different ways in which they're both responsible. And so that's kind of one of the ways in which I think about agency and responsibility as involving both groups and individuals.
But in that case, what kind of legal implications would that have in terms of determining who should be held responsible if this is even an if question, of course, but if the corporation itself as an entity or any individual employees, how would you go about doing that?
You mean like, how would you, like what kinds of how would we, how would this sort of responsibility or accountability like be actually, like handed down? Is that the kind of question?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, this is a difficult question, and lots of people have as so. On the individual side, it's actually much easier, right? We know how to hold individuals responsible. I'm not saying that we do it the right way, but we have social institutions that hold individuals culpable for criminal activity, let's say. I'm not here to talk about whether we should have prisons or incarceration or anything like that. That's a topic for another day. But we do have ways of holding people accountable. We can tell them that they have to pay a very large fine, or we incarcerate them, or we have a lot of different ways of holding individuals responsible. The problem is that with groups, you can't like restrict a group's freedom and that sort of thing, right? So some of the particular ways that you hold them both responsible is like, for instance, with a group, kind of not letting them, fines, for instance, that's something that's pretty standard, very, very large fines, which can be very punitive, right? Can be very discouraging of future behavior that is similar. But also, kind of restrictions on their operations. Kind of making them, we can imagine telling, if it's really, really serious, forcing them to take a hiatus, forcing them to, kind of, and in very, very serious cases, you kind of abolishing them altogether, right? Not allowing them to continue. And so there are different ways we can think about holding individuals and groups responsible in these sorts of ways.
Mm-hmm. But I was just thinking about, for example, the example you gave of Volkswagen and the fact that they said it was just a handful of bad apples, in that case, bad engineers. To what extent and how should we determine the way we should punish a collective, in this case, a corporation, taking into account that perhaps that could have some downward consequences for the people who work there, and that possibly should not be held accountable? Other employees, for example, who did not participate in the process of bad manufacturing, let's say.
Yes, I mean it's correct. I mean, and like to the extent that we do hold like Volkswagen itself responsible, it is possible that some innocent employees or innocent individuals end up suffering some consequences. I actually think that is not a negative feature of the view. I think that's just a negative feature of the world, that sometimes we suffer negative consequences. I mean, like, think about like any like any administration who's in a position of power. I mean, I, as an individual American, can suffer very serious consequences for a decision made by my governor or the president or Congress and so on, right? And so this is just a feature of like, I want to say like almost like the human condition, right? That like, we can suffer as innocent people negative consequences of decisions made by others. And so while I think it's right that some individual, perhaps innocent employees at Volkswagen, for instance, might suffer some consequences, I think that's just a feature of just human life. So I wouldn't necessarily regard that as like unique to my view or like a particular problem of my view, but rather it's just, I mean, it's an unfortunate consequence, I mean, of being, of happening to be employed by a corrupt or a deceptive or, an organization or a corporation or a company that engages in illegal behavior.
Mm-hmm. So just going back more to the epistemological side of things, how should we understand beliefs from a group perspective?
So on my own view, I think that, so just to kind of contextualize this a bit, one of the reasons why there is a fairly popular view in the literature whereby people think that groups can hold beliefs that no individual members do. The reason for that is because they think about cases. There's a lot of different cases motivating it, but here's like a couple. One might be like, suppose that there is like their parents, and let's just call them a very small group, right? There's two of them. And they have opposing beliefs about when their child ought to be able to like stay out till midnight, right? I don't know, whatever. One parent says it should be 18. One parent says that it should be 16. And so as a collective, as a little small group, they decide on 17. And so they tell the child, okay, we think that, 17 is the right age at which you can stay out till midnight. Now, neither actually believes this, right? One thinks it's 16, one thinks it's 18, and they kind of arrive at this sort of compromised position. Some people in the literature think that it is appropriate to say that the parents believe that it's 17, but neither individual parent believes that it's 17. So that's one example. You can imagine very similar cases that don't emerge out of like a compromised position. So another kind of example that is sometimes given is like a jury, right? So you can imagine a jury that is deliberating about guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, given the admissible evidence that they have access to, that they, as a group, with particular restrictions on what they can consider. So like quad juror, you can't consider hearsay evidence, but as an individual, you can. So on this view, like the jury just can't, as a well-functioning jury, consider hearsay evidence. So on the basis of the admissible evidence, they might have the belief that the defendant is not guilty. But on the basis of each individual member might have access to the hearsay evidence. And we can imagine that it was actually like said in the courtroom, but that the judge said you can't consider that. And so each individual member might believe that the defendant is in fact guilty. And so this is another case in which people in the literature, the inflationary theorists, argue that groups can have beliefs that no individual member does. These are two different kinds of examples. On my own view, I'm not persuaded by these sorts of examples. I think that there are a broad range of ways that we can describe these cases, right? I think that we can say in the jury case, the jury judges that the defendant is not guilty, that the jury accepts the proposition that the defendant is not guilty, that they deliver the verdict that the defendant is not guilty. But I don't think that there's any reason why our hands are tied into describing the jury as believing that. And in fact, I raised what I regard as some very serious problems for thinking that, for calling that belief. I think that there's very serious problems with that. And I'm happy to talk about that in a minute. But on my own view, the only view that can really get around the problems that I think face a view that says, like, for instance, the parents believe it or the jury believes it, is some sort of view where the individual beliefs of a group anchor the group's beliefs. So I don't think it's reducible to it. I don't think that that's the end of the story. I don't think that group belief just amounts to individuals believing it, but I think you need to have some individual members who hold the relevant belief to anchor that group's belief.
Mm-hmm. And how can we determine that group beliefs are justified? Is there a set of criteria to do that?
For determining when a group's belief is justified.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think on my view, as with belief, I think that justified belief. So let's just say, very broadly speaking, without going into too much detail, I think that there are two different components to justified group belief. The first is, I do think that there is some justification at the group level that is inherited, so to speak. I think that there's lots of complications, so don't interpret that like too straightforwardly. But I think that there is some justification that is sort of inherited by the justification had by individual group members. So I think that when a group has a belief and the individual members have that belief, the justification that the individual members have provide some of the justification that the group has. I think that justification can be enhanced, or it can be lessened or defeated. So let me just talk about the latter first. I think that individual members might all hold a justified belief in a proposition, but they might hold that belief for different and even very conflicting reasons. So if, so you and I might both believe that someone is planning a theft at a museum, but I might believe that someone is planning a theft because I believe that only Chester is planning that theft. And you might believe that someone is planning a theft because you believe that only Michael is planning the theft. And so when we hold a belief it seems like that belief that someone is planning a theft should have a great deal of justification because I believe it and you believe it and we're two members of that group. If we believe it for conflicting reasons, only Chester or only Michael, then it looks like the justification at the group level can actually be lower than the justification that each individual member has. So while I think that the justification that individual members have, it's sort of, like I said, it can be inherited or transmitted or transferred over to some extent to the belief of the group. What happens among the relationships of the justified beliefs of the groups can really bear on the status of that individual belief. Now, that's a case of negative, right? Where the justification is lower because the relations between the evidence brings it down, right? Our bases conflict. But I also think that there can be, like, let's say, collective deliberation or the sharing of evidence or discussion that happens at the group level that can sort of enhance the level of justification. So I think that while the justification of individuals provides something of a grounding or framework, like basic framework for the justification, the status can either be raised or lowered depending on what happens at the group level.
Mm-hmm. in your account, do you care about the social functions of belief? Like, for example, people manifesting certain beliefs serving as a signal of group membership or group allegiance, and not really caring too much about the epistemic values of those specific beliefs, like them being true or false?
That's a good question. I mean, I definitely, there's definitely literature out there on this question. I think I tend to deal with it a little bit less. I mean, I think that like what I really am interested in is the sort of the status, the rational status, the evidential status of those beliefs. So I really am interested in the question of what makes those beliefs, the basis for appropriate action. Like there's a question that we can ask, for instance, about the role, the political and social role that the Bush administration's claim played when they said there are weapons of mass destruction, that played a powerful social and political role. And I think that there are really important, interesting questions about that. I'm more interested in what was the status of that claim? Did the Bush administration have any good reason for saying that? Did they have beliefs about it? Did they have justified beliefs about it? Did they, these kinds of questions. So I think I'm less interested in like the social and political role that they play. I mean, I do have a chapter in my book on lying. I do have a chapter in my book about assertion and the role that statements and lies and all of this can play, broadly speaking. But I am really, I think, ultimately more interested, we might say, in the status of those claims, like the epistemic status, than I am in like sort of the broader social political role that they play, if that makes sense.
Yes, sure. I mean, I just asked you that question because sometimes when we talk about beliefs, people are talking more about values, for example, political values, religious values, whatever, moral values, than exactly, I mean, epistemic propositions that can be evaluated as true or false. And I was just wondering if that's something that plays a role in your approach or not, but.
Yeah, no, I can absolutely see that. And I mean, certainly I'm interested in, I think those issues kind of play like a background role and like a little bit less so like a direct role in the theory or the framework.
Okay. So what is social knowledge?
So I think that social knowledge can be understood in a lot of different ways. I think it's probably used in different ways in the literature. But the way that it's used primarily in this context in the epistemology of groups is in asking questions about whether there is kind of like a broad way of there being sort of knowledge in the world, so to speak, kind of social knowledge that really does not depend in any sort of way on what's happening at the individual level. So there's a philosopher, Alexander Bird, who really talks a fair bit about social knowledge. I think that it can be extended to like to think about some other interesting cases, but like one of the cases that he's interested in is, kind of imagine that there's like an important discovery made, right? Just, in science, just pick a particular area of science. And the author publishes the article, but it just doesn't get read. And it's just kind of like sitting there. So the author is alive, publishes it, it's in a journal. And then there's a period of time where the author is deceased and nobody even knows about it. And then after, a little period afterwards, people come to read the article and know about this. Bird wants to say that it's not as though there was like knowledge that sort of came in and out of existence. There's something really important that was continuous through that time. And he calls that social knowledge. So he thinks that even at that period, this is why it's like a really strong thesis. Even in that period where like no one had read the article and the author himself was deceased, during that period, Bird wants to say there still is something out there. There's still an important way in which that knowledge is out there. It's social knowledge. And so he wants to argue that even though there was like really significant differences in individual knowledge, there was something can call social knowledge that was continuous throughout that time.
Mm-hmm. And in this case, social knowledge would be something that applies in the context of science, for example, correct?
Well, I think he doesn't want to just say, I mean, I think he wants to say that, like, yeah, there's like the scientific community, or there's like scientific knowledge as an example of social knowledge. But I think there can be certainly other instances. I mean, I think that the really significant part for him, I mean, he's got different things that he says, but I think like the accessibility of it is one of them. Like, I don't think he wants to say that like there's social knowledge, like there's like clearly a difference between like the facts in the world being something that could be studied and lead to knowledge, and the fact that this was already, like, so to speak, done, right, and published, and like the findings were already out there, and there was a sense in which it was already like kind of molded or kind of shaped into knowledge. And in that sense, then it was accessible, and its accessibility makes it, according to Bird, something, like what he calls social knowledge.
Mm-hmm. So going into another topic of your book, what does it mean for a group to assert a proposition?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about assertion that I think is importantly different from some of the earlier things we were talking about with like belief and justified belief, is that I think that there are good reasons to be fairly inflationary about group assertion. And what I mean by that is I do think that groups can assert things that no individual member asserts or, kind of would assert or something like that. And that's because I think that one of the ways of thinking about this is that groups can, and often do, communicate or assert through particular individuals. And those individuals, we can just say, broadly speaking, are like spokespersons. I mean, I don't mean anything like an official White House spokesperson or anything like that, but just someone who's designated to have the authority to speak on behalf of a group. So like just very, very, very simple example is like the chair of my department has the authority to speak on behalf of the department, has the authority to advocate for things on behalf of the department, or to report the department's views on things. And so one of the things that I think is really interesting about this relationship between groups and spokespersons is that the spokesperson, for instance, need not even be a member of the group. And in fact, oftentimes that they are not. I mean, just imagine any time that someone has a lawyer who is speaking on their behalf, like for a group, the lawyer doesn't become a member of Pfizer, or a member of Philip Morris just because he or she is speaking on behalf of that group. So oftentimes spokespersons just are not members of the group. And so in that sense, when the spokesperson says something on behalf of a group, I want to say that that's like constitutive of the group's assertion. That really just is the group's assertion. And so you have a group asserting something, even though no individual member of that group asserts it. Now, we might say something like, well, yeah, but I mean, so what that like the lawyer is technically not a member of Pfizer or Philip Morris. There still is a sense in which the group assertion is just reducing to the assertion of an individual, the spokesperson. So what difference does it make at some important theoretical level, whether or not that individual is an outside attorney hired or as a member of the group? But one of the things I think is really interesting to note is that a lot of the norms that we think govern assertion do not govern that spokesperson. So it's very, very standard in the literature to ask whether, for instance, something like knowledge governs assertion. And by that, the question is, do we think that knowledge is the norm of assertion, so that you should really only assert something if you know it? Okay, you shouldn't really just go around, like I shouldn't just be asserting things, like I shouldn't just be running around saying like the COVID-19 vaccine is safe unless I know that, right? I should have the right epistemic basis for saying that if I'm going to say it. But when we think about what spokespersons are doing, we don't hold them to that norm. We don't think that spokespersons ought to be speaking from knowledge. Or another norm that's often talked about is that assertion is governed by sincerity. People should only assert something if they're speaking sincerely or they believe it, and so on. But again, that doesn't apply at the level of a spokesperson. Think again about the chair of the department. The chair of the department is not supposed to go to the dean and speak sincerely, meaning saying what his or her beliefs are. They're not supposed to be speaking from knowledge. They're supposed to be speaking on behalf of the group. They're supposed to be representing the view of the group. And so in that sense, I think that the spokesperson is not actually asserting. They're simply sort of like an instrument for the group to assert. And so in that sense, there really is, I think, a robust sense in which it's the group asserting and no individual member. And so in that way, I think I'm like a fairly robust inflationary theorist about groups. I think that the norms governing assertion attach to the group, not to the person speaking on behalf of the group. So I don't think that the norms governing assertion attach to individuals. I think they attach to at the group level.
Mm-hmm. And when can we say that a particular group is lying?
Well, I mean, I think that once we understand that, so let's just start with like what we think individual lying is. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a lot of debate about that, but I mean, I'm just going to kind of just throw out I think not a super controversial view, but so we might say that a group lies or an individual, I'm sorry, let's just say like a person lies if she says something. So she asserts something and she doesn't believe it. And she asserts it with the intention to be deceptive about that claim. That's just a very, a fairly standard account of what it is to lie. I think that, and this kind of goes back a little bit. I think it's worth just sort of pausing and returning to an earlier point that came up when we were talking about what it is for a group to believe something. One of the things I mentioned is that I think that there are some really serious objections facing some of what we might call deflationary views. So a lot of those inflationary views. So a lot of those inflationary views understand, again, group belief as being the sort of thing where a group can believe it even though no individual member does. And the way they understand group belief, many of them, is in terms of some sort of collective activity. So it's very, very standard for those theorists to think that what really matters, like let's just think about the jury or the parents, right? The very simple parents case. The parents jointly accept the proposition that 17 is the right age for their child to stay out till midnight, even though neither believes it. And so that joint acceptance, that joint commitment, and the commitment to sort of stand by that proposition as a group, the parents, is what confers the status of group belief onto it. But one of the things that I argue in my book is that this view is really problematic. And part of the reason for that is because paradigmatic examples of groups lying fit that model. So let's just think about like Philip Morris, which is like a pretty, famous example of a very significant group lie that had very deadly consequences. So it's very easy to imagine the board of directors or the people in Philip Morris who have power jointly accepting that smoking is safe, right? I mean, in fact, that's sort of what they do to get the message out there that they want to promote. And so when we see that a very classic example of a group lying, jointly accepting that smoking is safe, would end up on this view being a straightforward belief, I think that that's a really, really significant argument against thinking about group belief in that sort of way. It becomes indistinguishable from what I would call a paradigmatic case of a group lying. And so because of that, when I'm thinking about group lies, one of the key things is that a condition of lying is that whoever is asserting something that they don't believe. So it's really important to keep in mind that like my view of belief anchors belief in individual belief. So I don't have that problem that inflationary theorists about belief have, where they just can't distinguish group belief from group lies. And so on my view of what it is for a group to lie, one of the key components is that it would be a group asserts something and I have an account of assertion when the group doesn't believe it, and then I would plug in my particular account of belief. And then it would also have a condition about the intention to be deceptive. And I think there's a lot of really good work on group intention, and I don't do much in my book on that because there's a much more robust body of literature on that.
Mm-hmm. I've already asked you a similar question when discussing how can we decide who we should hold responsible for a particular action, if a group or an individual. But is it possible, is there a set of criteria to determine if a particular lie is a group lie or an individual lie?
How do we distinguish between those? Is that the question?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. So, I think that one of the things is like, let's think about assertion. So when a group asserts through a spokesperson, that spokesperson is asserting with the authority to speak on behalf of the group. And one of the things that I also build into the account is that it's not just it has the authority, but it's speaking in virtue of that authority. So it's speaking with the authority to say, this is what the group's view is. And so that's why, the chair of the department can go to the dean and say, let me tell you who I think the best candidate is. That's his or her own personal assertion. But when the chair goes and says, the Department of Philosophy wants to hire John Smith, that's who we think is the best candidate. That is not the chair might actually totally disagree with that, right? The chair might actually have wanted to hire a different candidate. And so when the chair is speaking, has the authority to speak for the department and is speaking in virtue of that authority, that is not her own assertion. Does that?
Yeah. I think it does. I mean, it also resembles a little bit the discussion we had when talking about attributing moral responsibility, right?
Right. I think that's right. Exactly. I mean, there are some questions, people ask me like, well, like when the White House spokesperson, like think about like during the Trump administration, like, don't we think that like the White House press secretary, don't we think that that person is culpable and the Trump administration? I think that these are really complicated questions. I think in some cases, no, and in some cases, maybe. But if the assertions are really just on behalf of the Trump administration, then maybe that person should not have that job. And maybe we would hold that person responsible for taking the job in a corrupt administration. But I don't think that that person is necessarily responsible for the individual assertions. I think that if they are the Trump administration's assertions, then it's the Trump administration that is responsible.
Mm-hmm. And how do we move from an understanding of how the epistemology of groups work to assigning moral responsibility to groups?
So I think we were just sort of like circling around that question in thinking about the Trump administration. I think that when we're thinking about moral responsibility, let's think about like for assertions and actions. Sometimes individual members really are just instruments. And in those cases, we might want to hold them responsible for instance, for being a part of that group, for like kind of taking that employment, right? But it might be like their culpability might be very low level. They might not even fully grasp, like, imagine that like you're just a spokesperson and you get a list of like things and you have no idea the truth value of them. You might be responsible for taking a job where you are the spokesperson or the mouthpiece of things where you don't know the truth value for them. But you might not be responsible for any of those individual claims. You might, for all you know, think that they're true. It might be the people in power who know that they're false, but are saying something, reporting them to be true. And so in that case, I think that the spokesperson might be culpable for certain things, but certainly not to be held responsible for the assertions themselves. And I think the same assertion can be viewed as an action. So I think the same thing can be said for various kinds of actions. There might be cases where, an individual really is just playing like sort of an instrumental role, meaning they're just sort of like a cog in a machine, and they don't even have all of the understanding or the grasp of this big machine. They're really just narrowly aware of like their little role as a cog. And so in those cases, I just think that there really are grounds for holding the collective entity way more responsible and for a very different kind of thing than the individual, who really is maybe culpable for ignorance, for not asking more questions, but maybe not culpable in any way for like the broader action that is really harmful.
Mm-hmm. So just one last topic / question. What are the kinds of epistemic phenomena, probably different from the ones we've covered here, that the epistemology of groups can shed new light on?
I think that there are a lot of different questions to be asked. I think the epistemology of groups is a really understudied area. And so I think, for instance, there are a lot of really, so, one of the things that I raised is that, like, when you bring a whole bunch of individuals together and they're all epistemic agents and they all have different bodies of evidence, there are a host of questions that arise about what happens at the group level when you have all of these individuals with these radically different bases of evidence. Does my whole framework of evidence get like thrown into the mix of understanding my membership in any group, just some bodies of evidence? Can there be no conflicts among the bases that we all have? What does it mean to say that we believe something for a reason? Does it have to be a reason that we accept, or does it just matter that like we have all of these different kind of that there are just some of us who accept it for those reasons? So I think one of the questions that is really important is, like, as we assess groups and as we try to understand their actions, their intentions, and these are deep, important questions. That come up when we're talking about things like genocide, right? When we're talking about things like propaganda, or we're talking about, ethnic cleansing, right? When we're talking about like big questions, it matters a lot what groups, what collective entities, kind of believe and know and have evidence about, and so on. And so I guess one of the things I would say is just like deeper questions about a lot of the things that we talked about, right, matter a great deal. I feel like in some respects, my book just scratches the surface of some of these questions because it just kind of gets them on the table and starts heading in the direction of some answers. But taking far deeper dives into asking some of them, I think, is some of the really important work for the future.
Mm-hmm. So this is sort of a recent subfield. In the field of epistemology, these sort of questions on more of a group level have not been traditionally asked. Is that it?
Certainly not traditionally asked in the level of detail that they need to be asked. Absolutely. I think that there have been, like, Margaret Gilbert has done work for a long time on collective entities. She also did a lot of work on like the metaphysics side, but like really in-depth, deep dives into the epistemology of groups, there's been, I think, like far less work than there needs to be. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And just as a last question, what are the kinds of questions that you think could be explored in the epistemology of groups and that you would like to be explored in the future?
I mean, I think that there's a lot more work that needs to be done on group evidence, on, what does it mean to talk? Do groups have like dispositional beliefs? Do groups have tacit beliefs? What does it mean for groups to have to draw on bodies of evidence? I mean, there might be, there's questions about the role that emotions play. Do groups have emotions? If groups have emotions, can they play any sort of epistemic role? There's a whole bunch of work on like, testimonial injustice and epistemic injustice and all of these sorts of questions. What does it mean for groups to be perpetrators of those? I mean, do they have to have like a unified intention? I just think that there's a lot of work. I mean, I think that, again, I feel like to some extent, my book was really just asking very basic mechanics questions because there's been so little work done on it. But I think that there's a tremendous amount of work that can be done in the future.
Great. So apart from the book, The Epistemology of Groups, are there any good places on the internet where people can find your work?
Yeah, I think I have a website where I have links to some of my work. It's not super updated, so I don't think that's like always the best place, but I think a lot of the papers that I've published in this area, I think will probably be linked to from Phil Papers. So I think that that would probably be a good place.
Okay, great. I will be leaving links to your work in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Lackey, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was really lovely to be here.
Hi guys, thank you for watching the interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show. It's thanks to people like you that it keeps running. I will leave links in the description box to Patreon and PayPal. Any amount, even just $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Kessel, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enrique Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreff, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Des Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostaszewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidi, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, my producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Staffini, Akian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Thomas Trumbull, and my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.